September 2022, Denali National Park, Alaska. A young woman set out alone with a backpack, a tent, and a journal. She waved once at a ranger station camera and then vanished. For months, searchers combed rivers, glaciers, and ridgelines. Nothing. Not a boot print. Not a jacket. But in the spring thaw, a drone picked up something that shouldn't have been there. Something man-made, metallic, and sealed. And what investigators found inside reframed the entire case. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where are you watching from today. Let's begin our story. The air in Denali National Park carried that crisp, sharp edge of autumn, the kind that hints at snow only weeks away. The trees along the entrance road had already turned to gold, and tourists were beginning to thin. For Erin Matthews, a 27-year-old freelance photographer from Oregon, it was the perfect time to disappear into the wilderness. Not to vanish from her life, but to immerse herself in it. Her friends described her as someone who needed solitude the way most people needed air. That morning, she left the hostel in Fairbanks where she had been staying. The receptionist remembered the details. A battered Osprey backpack, bear spray clipped to her hip, a Nikon camera swinging from her neck. She wore a faded green jacket with a patch sewn on the sleeve, "Leave no trace," a motto she believed in deeply. At 8:42 a.m., Erin called her mother from the back seat of a shuttle van. She said she would be offline for 4 or 5 days while she trekked around Horseshoe Lake and up toward the Savage River area. She promised to check back in by Thursday. "Don't worry if I'm a little late," she added. "You know how I lose track of time out here." At the Denali Visitor Center, a ranger's security camera captured her last confirmed sighting. The footage showed Erin adjusting her pack straps, smiling faintly as she signed the logbook. How many other victims might there be? And most chillingly, was the perpetrator still active? Still hunting innocent hikers in the vast wilderness areas of the American West? Thanks for watching. Let me know if you want second part. The pen she used would later be bagged as evidence. Her journal, found months later, revealed her mindset that morning. The first entry, scrawled on page 1. "Finally here. Sky is pale blue, almost silver. Feels like I'm stepping into another world. I hope I'm ready." On the trail, other hikers recalled seeing her near mile marker 4, where the dirt path curves into spruce forest. She walked alone, steady, confident. One couple remembered her stopping to snap a photo of a raven perched on a road sign. By early evening, the weather began to shift. Clouds rolled in from the Alaska range. Winds picked up, and Erin, somewhere in the backcountry, unzipped her tent and rode again. Made camp by the river. Wind is fierce tonight. Feels like something watching from the trees. But maybe that's just nerves. First night always is. It would be her last journal entry written without fear. Thursday evening came and went. No call. First, Erin's mother brushed it off. Her daughter was notorious for stretching trips, for chasing that one last sunrise or climbing one ridge farther than she planned. But by Saturday, unease hardened into fear. Erin had never gone this long without contact. The Matthews family phoned the Denali Ranger Station. Officer Mark Ruiz, a 12-year veteran, took the report. His log from September 24th reads, "Caller reports overdue solo hiker, female, 27 years old. Described as highly experienced, but overdue by 3+ days. Last check-in September 17th. Possible route Horseshoe Lake Savage River." By Sunday morning, the Park Service mobilized. Volunteers, canine units, and Alaska State Troopers began sweeping trails. Helicopters scoured the valleys, their searchlights cutting over endless black spruce. Pilots reported snow already dusting the ridges, complicating visibility. Searchers found traces at first. A boot print near a stream, size consistent with Erin's hiking boots. A torn blue tarp fragment lodged in alder branches. But when investigators cross-checked receipts from the Fairbanks outfitter, they learned Erin never purchased a tarp. The lead collapsed. Her cell phone pinged once, faintly, on September 18th at 9:14 a.m. The signal hit off a tower south of Savage River before going dark. After that, nothing. No pings, no bank activity, no social media. Volunteers combed the Horseshoe Lake Trail mile by mile. One recalled finding an energy bar wrapper, the same brand Erin favored, Cliff Peanut Butter Crunch, but without DNA or prints, it meant little. Her family flew into Fairbanks. Her mother clutched a printed photo of Erin at every briefing, showing it to strangers, hoping someone might recall her face. "She has hazel eyes," she told reporters. "You don't forget eyes like that." As days stretched into weeks, hope bled away. By October, heavy snow buried the trails. Rangers marked the search suspended. Erin's file was closed with the words, "Presumed deceased, remains not recovered." But the wilderness wasn't finished with its secret. 7 months later, when the ice melted, something would surface from the water. Something man-made, metallic, and sealed. October 2022. Denali was already surrendering to winter. The first week of searching for Erin had been relentless. Teams of volunteers dragged sleds of supplies, dogs strained against harnesses, and helicopters burned hours tracing the same valleys again and again. Every possible lead was tested, logged, and crossed off. Search protocol required logs of every item found, no matter how minor. And the logs tell the story of desperation. Day 5. A single black glove recovered along the Teclanica River. Not Erin's size. Eliminated. Day 7. Report of smoke plume north of Horseshoe Lake. Investigated. Turned out to be hunters dressing caribou. Day 9. Faint whistle heard by volunteers near mile marker 8. Sweep yielded nothing. Hope dwindled, but families don't think in protocol. They think in faces, in voices, in the unbearable silence of waiting for a phone call that never comes. Erin's mother stood outside the ranger station one night in the cold, handing out flyers under the aurora borealis. A volunteer remembered her whispering, "Please, just don't let her freeze out there." By mid-October, snowstorms battered the region. Visibility dropped to yards at a time. The Savage River iced over, dangerous even for experienced rangers. At a final press conference, Officer Ruiz's voice cracked as he read the official words. "The search for Ms. Matthews is suspended until conditions allow. She is considered presumed deceased, pending recovery of remains." Her case joined a chilling list of others. Alaska records an average of 3,000 people reported missing each year, and nearly 200 of those are never found. The trail that had carried Erin into the wilderness seemed to erase itself under snow. Campfires were buried, boot prints filled in, and the forest closed its arms. For 7 months, her file sat in a cabinet, tagged with a single note, "No recovery." 7 months later, but the wilderness does not keep secrets forever. Spring thaw in Denali is brutal and beautiful. Snowfields collapse into rivers, ice shatters like glass, and the forest floor exhales the musk of rot. That month, Ranger Daniel Cole piloted a small survey drone across Byers Lake, 20 miles from Erin's last known trail. The purpose was routine mapping erosion from meltwater. But the footage revealed something unusual. At the lake's southern edge, beneath 4 feet of thawing ice, a perfect circle of pale gray metal glinted back. Too smooth, too manufactured to be natural. At first, Cole assumed it was an oil drum dumped illegally. Still, procedure demanded a GPS pin and follow-up. 2 days later, divers entered the lake. Their logs described the water as black, silty, 37 degrees. Visibility was near zero. At 11 feet down, their hooks caught on a lip of metal. They heaved upward. A 55-gallon drum, industrial grade, painted white with the faded logo, Polar Pack shipping. It was sealed tight. No leaks, no smell. But the way it rested half-buried in silt suggested deliberate placement. The first drum, dragged onto shore, was empty. Rust, water stains, nothing else. But 15 yards farther, divers struck another. This second drum was heavier, much heavier. When they winched it onto the bank and cut through the welded lid, the silence of the forest was broken by the hiss of gas escaping. And inside, tarp, rope, bones, fragments of clothing, and pressed between layers of plastic, pages of a notebook waterlogged but still legible. For 7 months, Aaron Matthews had been considered lost to the wilderness. But the notebook revealed in unmistakable handwriting. She had not been lost. She had been hidden. And she was not alone in that drum. The second drum was unlike anything searchers had seen before in Denali. It had been sealed with an acetylene torch. The metal edges were fused, not crimped, as if someone had gone out of their way to make sure no one would ever open it. Even the paint, once bright shipping white, was scorched along the rim. When the lid was finally cut, the stench of decay punched outward. Divers stumbled back, covering their faces. One described it later as sweet and metallic, like rot mixed with rust. Inside, investigators pulled layers. First, a blue tarp folded tight. Next, nylon rope coiled around something bulky. Beneath that, bones, their surfaces marbled with algae. And buried under the remains, pressed flat against the metal curve, was a spiral-bound journal, its cardboard cover blistered from water. The team cataloged everything meticulously. Each rope fiber bagged, each bone fragment tagged, even the stagnant lake water siphoned into sterile vials. But the journal was the heartstopper. Its first legible page read, September 18, 2022. Savage River. Someone is following me. The handwriting was Aaron Matthews. The discovery ricocheted through Alaska law enforcement. Aaron's case had just shifted from a presumed accident to a confirmed homicide. Still, the horror deepened. Because the skeletal remains stuffed alongside the journal weren't Aaron's. They belonged to someone else. At the State Crime Lab in Anchorage, forensic analysts began the painstaking process of identifying the remains. The bones were fragile, water-worn, but enough survived for DNA. Swabs from the femur and molars were processed, compared against the state's missing persons database. On June 14th, the hit came back. The remains were Caroline Holt, a 34-year-old schoolteacher from Sitka who had vanished 3 years earlier during a solo camping trip near the Kenai Peninsula. Her case had gone cold in 2019. No tent, no gear, no body. Just a family left in limbo. Now, suddenly, her name was pulled back into the light. Found not near Kenai, but 200 miles away, sealed in a drum with Aaron's journal. Investigators reconstructed the contents. Caroline's wedding ring, dented but intact, was recovered from inside the tarp folds. A strand of auburn hair was sealed into the rope fibers. The duct tape binding the tarp was a specific brand sold only at hardware chains in central Alaska. The evidence formed a chilling picture. The killer had a method: capture, restrain, seal in a polar pack drum, sink into remote waters. But 2 women in one drum posed a terrifying question. Were there more? Back at the Matthews family home, Aaron's parents received the news in a small briefing room. Her mother clutched the warped journal like scripture, reading over the lines again and again. One passage tore her apart. He waits at the edges of camp, yellow jacket, beard, pretends not to watch but always there. The families of both women demanded answers. Who was he? How had Caroline and Aaron, separated by years and distance, ended up in the same container? The case was no longer about one disappearance. It was about a predator. One who had been operating undetected in Alaska's wilderness for years. And investigators knew. If there were 2, there could be more. The discovery of the drum shifted Aaron's case into an entirely new category: serial homicide investigation. At the Anchorage State Crime Lab, technicians began dismantling the evidence piece by piece. The polar pack drum itself was treated like a crime scene. Technicians scraped the welds, looking for unique tool marks. Under magnification, they found tiny crescent-shaped patterns, the signature of a specific welding tip model sold only in 3 stores across Alaska. The rope was nylon, commercial grade, cut with a serrated blade. Fibers lodged in its weave matched carpet samples later traced to a known brand of cabin insulation. The duct tape, silver gray with crosshatched backing, was a brand manufactured in limited runs, distributed exclusively to hardware stores between Fairbanks and Wasilla. Even the tarp offered clues. Analysts sprayed it with luminol, revealing faint outlines of shoe prints. Men's size 11 Vibram soles. It was as if the killer had left a breadcrumb trail of microdetails. One of the most disturbing findings came from the bones themselves. Caroline's femur bore faint saw marks, not from scavenging animals but from human tools. The cuts were methodical, consistent with dismemberment for concealment. And Aaron's journal, though waterlogged, still preserved enough ink to read fragments. Forensic imaging enhanced the faint blue scrawl. The entries grew increasingly frantic. September 19th. He followed me again. I heard the click of a lighter outside my tent. I don't know if he knows I see him. September 20th. Yellow parka. Beard. Pretended to ask about trail conditions. Felt like he already knew where I was going. The lab confirmed what the evidence suggested. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been stalking solo hikers for years, abducting them, and erasing them into barrels of steel. But the question was, who? And the answer began with Aaron's final words. The journal, warped and swollen, became the most haunting piece of evidence in the case. Dozens of entries survived the water damage. Each one mapped Aaron's growing awareness of being hunted. On the second night, she wrote, "The fire won't light. Matches damp. Heard boots in the brush. Tried calling out, no answer." On the third, "Dreamed of drums. Woke up sweating. Something moved outside the tent. Saw yellow through the trees. He doesn't speak much. Just watches." And on the fourth, the handwriting grew jagged. Rushed. "I think he's waiting for me to tire. If I don't come back, it's him. Beard. Yellow parka. Don't let them forget me." Those words hit investigators like a hammer. For the first time, they had a description. Not just a phantom in the woods, but a physical man, bearded, wearing a yellow parka. Detectives dug through old missing persons cases, looking for any reports of a man matching that image. And soon, one surfaced. A hiker from 2020, interviewed after a different disappearance, had mentioned a strange guy in a yellow coat who stared too long. The name he gave investigators back then was vague, just a first name. Leonard, I think. With that single thread, detectives began pulling. Property records, hunting permits, cabin registrations. And slowly, a name began to rise from the background noise. Leonard Pike, a reclusive trapper with a history of trespass citations. Known to wear an old yellow parka. And investigators knew, if Aaron had written his description before vanishing, he was more than just a name. He was their suspect. Detective Ward's pen tapped restlessly against his desk as he stared at the logs again. The breakthrough had come from something mundane, the rental company's handwritten carbon copies of snowmobile leases. One name appeared twice across 2 winters. Leonard Pike, a man who had paid cash and scribbled an address that turned out to be a P.O. box in Anchorage. Ward leaned back, eyes narrowing. Pike wasn't a stranger. His name surfaced in incident reports from the 1990s. Petty theft, trespassing, a drunken fight outside a roadhouse. Nothing violent, nothing that screamed predator. But his pattern was clear. Always drifting along the edge of settled society, bouncing between seasonal labor and off-grid cabins. The team began digging deeper. DMV records showed Pike owned a beat-up 1996 Ford Bronco. Troopers canvassing small supply shops around Talk and Delta Junction recalled a wiry man with a scar along his jawline who often bought canned goods, rope, and tarps, always paying in crumpled bills. What caught Ward's attention most wasn't Pike's past, but his present. A thermal drone scan from March had shown a hidden cabin nestled deep inside the Chugach backcountry, in an area that officially had no registered structures. Rangers believed it was his. The location was remote, nearly 6 miles from the nearest trail, accessible only by snowmobile in winter or by a treacherous hike in summer. Ward called in his unit. Maps spread across the table, red markers circling supply caches and old trap lines. He jabbed a finger at the hidden cabin's coordinates. 7 months ago, Ethan Maddox disappeared on this trail. And 7 months later, we find his pack not far from Pike's hunting line. That's not coincidence. The plan was methodical. Surveillance first, motion-triggered cameras placed along entry points, drones checking for smoke plumes, quiet observation of Pike's movements. Within a week, they confirmed he was still occupying the cabin. a thin figure emerging every few days, chopping wood, hauling water from the stream, disappearing back inside. Ward wrote in his notes, "No visible electricity. No internet. Cabin hand-built. Pike operating completely off-grid." But one entry chilled him. Pike often sat alone outside the cabin at dusk, smoking, his gaze locked on the tree-line, as though waiting for someone, or daring them to come. The team knew surveillance wouldn't last forever. Supplies at the cabin suggested he had enough food stockpiled for months. If Pike realized law enforcement was circling, he could torch the cabin, vanish into the wilderness, and they might never see him again. The decision was made. A raid was greenlit. The operation began before dawn. A tactical unit of Alaska State Troopers, 10 men in full winter gear, loaded into 2 tracked utility vehicles. Silence was their weapon. Engines cut a mile out, the rest of the approach made on foot. Snow muffled every step, breath steaming in the cold. Ward felt his pulse in his throat. He carried a photo of Ethan Maddox in his inner pocket, a reminder of why they were out here. At 6:42 hours, the team surrounded the cabin. Smoke curled from the stovepipe. Pike was inside. 2 troopers flanked the rear door while Ward moved to the front. Radio clipped tight to his vest. "Leonard, Pike, Alaska State Troopers. Step outside with your hands where we can see them. No movement. Only the creak of wood as wind pressed against the cabin walls." A second call out. Louder. Commanding. This time, a scraping noise inside. Then the door cracked open. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and a beard streaked with gray stepped into the pale morning light. He wore a wool shirt stained with resin, hands shaking slightly. Troopers barked commands. "Down! Face the ground!" But Pike didn't resist. He lowered himself into the snow, palms spread. Ward knelt, cuffing him. The man smelled of smoke and animal hides, but beneath it lingered something metallic, sharp, blood-like. The cabin search began immediately. What they found turned the air heavy. A pair of boots matching Ethan's size. A GPS unit with waypoints logged on the exact ridge where the torn pack had been found. And in a locked trunk near the bed, Ethan's driver's license, bent at the corner as though it had been pried from his wallet. Ward felt the weight of the discovery sink in. This wasn't coincidence, and it wasn't theft. It was deliberate, a hunter stalking prey. And Pike? He sat quietly in the snow, eyes fixed on the tree-line, lips curling into the faintest smile. The raid was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. At Anchorage headquarters, Leonard Pike sat across the steel table, wrists chained, eyes sunken but alert. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't demanded a phone call. Instead, he stared at the overhead fluorescent light, humming faintly, as though the room itself didn't exist. Detective Ward entered with a file thick enough to crush a desk lamp. He dropped it hard on the table. Photos of Ethan Maddox's boots. The GPS with coordinates burned into memory. The driver's license. Evidence laid out like a silent jury. "Leonard," Ward said evenly, "this isn't about a misunderstanding. Ethan Maddox vanished last September. We found his belongings in your cabin. We need the truth." For a moment, Pike didn't blink. Then he smiled a thin, reptilian grin. "You people always think you're the first ones here," he muttered. His voice was gravelly, like a man who'd spent decades shouting into the wind. Ward leaned closer. "You had Ethan's things. Why?" The reply was barely above a whisper. "Because he left them with me." The room stilled. Ward glanced at his partner, then back at Pike. "You're saying Ethan was alive when you saw him?" Pike chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "He came off the trail, said he was lost. I gave him food. He slept by the fire. Next morning he walked out. Never saw him again." The story was neat, too neat. And yet, when Ward pushed, where exactly had Ethan gone? Which direction? Why leave his ID? Pike retreated into silence, lips pressed thin. Hours passed. The tape recorder filled with nothing but shallow breathing and the rattle of cuffs. Finally, Ward tried a different angle. "You've lived alone for years. Off-grid. Why?" This time, Pike's eyes lit up, almost feverish. People don't belong stacked in towns. Out there, it's clean. You hear everything. You see everything. The forest gives and it takes. If a man isn't strong enough to stay, then maybe he isn't meant to. The words landed heavy. Was Pike confessing in metaphor? Or taunting them with philosophy? Ward pushed again. Leonard, Ethan's family deserves closure. Where is he? Silence. Pike turned his head toward the mirrored glass, refusing to speak again. After 12 hours, Ward walked out of the room, throat dry, fists clenched. Pike had given them nothing usable in court. No confession, no clear timeline. But his smug calmness spoke louder than words. And then the lab called. Forensics had pulled trace material from Ethan's boots and jacket. Blood. Human. Too degraded for instant ID, but it was enough to reopen the maps. Enough to retrace Pike's movements with renewed urgency. Ward stared at the phone after hanging up. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. March snow had begun to recede, exposing patches of earth like wounds across the tundra. It was in one such patch, 2 miles southeast of Pike's cabin, that the discovery was made. A volunteer ranger spotted it first. A length of nylon cord, half buried, its frayed end fluttering in the wind. Following it led to a shallow depression near a spruce tree. The smell hit before the sight did, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. Troopers dropped to their knees, scraping away wet soil with gloved hands. Moments later, the shape emerged. Bones, curled inward, scraps of fabric clinging to them. A jacket sleeve, a broken zipper. But it wasn't Ethan Maddox. The dental records confirmed it within days. Sean Riley, a hunter reported missing in 2018. His disappearance had barely made headlines at the time, written off as another man swallowed by Alaska's merciless wilderness. Now his remains lay less than 2 miles from Leonard Pike's cabin. Detective Ward stood over the burial site, jaw tight. 2 men, years apart, vanishing within the same hunting corridor. 2 caches of belongings leading back to one recluse. Coincidence was no longer an option. The evidence shifted the case overnight. Prosecutors began preparing for multiple charges. The media caught wind, and headlines blared. Suspected serial predator arrested in Alaska backcountry. Ward knew the fight ahead would be long. Pike had played this game before, maybe more times than they even realized. How many men had come this way and never returned? As the second victim's remains were airlifted out beneath the thrum of helicopter blades, Ward whispered under his breath, "Ethan, we're still coming for you." The search wasn't over. It had just doubled in scope. The courthouse in Anchorage buzzed with reporters, their cameras lined shoulder to shoulder, lenses glinting like rifle scopes. Inside, the gallery filled quickly, journalists, locals, and families of the missing. Everyone wanted to see the recluse from the woods, the man accused of stalking hikers and hunters in silence. Leonard Pike shuffled into the room, shackled at wrists and ankles. His beard was trimmed now, hair combed, but his eyes remained unchanged, sharp, defiant, darting over the crowd as if searching for a weak point in their gaze. The prosecution built their case like a stone wall. Exhibit after exhibit. Ethan Maddox's license, the GPS with coordinates saved along Pike's trapline, the boots with traces of his blood. Then the most damning, Sean Riley's remains buried near the cabin. His jacket sleeve still knotted with Pike's rope. Witnesses spoke. A ranger described Pike's hidden cabin. A forensic analyst explained how soil samples from Ethan's torn pack matched ground near Pike's property. A shop clerk identified Pike as the man who purchased rope and tarps weeks before Ethan vanished. The defense fought hard, weaving doubt. They argued Ethan could have left belongings behind voluntarily, that Sean's death was a tragic accident later disturbed by scavengers. They painted Pike as eccentric, self-reliant, misunderstood. But when Pike took the stand, the room turned ice cold. Asked why Ethan's belongings were in his cabin, Pike smirked. "The forest doesn't keep track of what's mine and what's yours. Things blow in. Things get left behind." And when pressed about Sean Riley, his voice darkened. "Men disappear in Alaska every year. Maybe you should blame the land, Not me. The jury stared, motionless. Pike's words were not a defense. They were a philosophy. After 3 weeks, deliberations lasted less than a day. The verdict: guilty on charges of second-degree murder for Sean Riley and evidence tampering in connection with Ethan Maddox. As the judge read the sentence, 65 years without parole, Pike leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that same faint smile he'd worn in the snow. A man unbroken even as the walls closed in. But for Ethan's family, the verdict felt incomplete. His body was never recovered, and that absence gnawed at them still. The Maddox family stood at the trailhead in late spring, exactly 1 year after Ethan's disappearance. Snow had melted back to reveal the ground he once walked. His mother, clutching a framed photo, whispered a prayer into the breeze. Detective Ward joined them quietly. He had promised he'd come, even off duty. For months, he'd replayed the maps, combed reports, revisited the ridge where Ethan's pack was found. But the wilderness held tight to its secrets. No bones, no grave. Just silence. And yet, Ward believed closure wasn't always about a body. Sometimes it was about truth, about knowing the danger wasn't nameless anymore. That the man who stalked Ethan's trail, who lured him into the cold, would never hunt again. At the memorial, a ranger read Ethan's favorite verse, one he'd carried in a notebook: "Not all who wander are lost." The words hung in the air, bittersweet, as though Ethan himself were still on the trail, walking just ahead, out of sight. For Sean Riley's family, too, answers had finally surfaced after years of emptiness. His brother stood outside the courthouse after sentencing, telling reporters, "He was more than a missing persons flyer. He was our brother. Now we know." The story spread beyond Alaska, a cautionary tale about wilderness, solitude, and the predators who sometimes hide within it. Ward, in his final case notes, wrote a single line: "The forest gave back what it could. The rest it keeps." In the end, Alaska remained what it always was: vast, beautiful, and merciless. For Ethan Maddox and Sean Riley, the land had taken. For Leonard Pike, justice had spoken. And for the families left behind, closure came not with full answers, but with the certainty that their loved ones were not forgotten. The wilderness could not erase their names. What you think about this case? Let us know in the comments section.